Welcome to UnstuckAF, a podcast here to help you do you better. There's a path that starts where you are, passes through who you are, and leads where you want to go. We're here to hear from people who've walked that path or who are walking it right now. This is Orlando Bishop, Coach Orlando, and I thank you for listening as we learn how to get unstuck, how to be unstuck, how to live unstuck. Unstuck as fuck. Welcome to UnstuckAF, and today I have my friend Andrea Varga. She's a professor, SUNY New Paltz, of theater design and of sustainability. More immediately, and how we've ended up getting this interview that I'm really excited about. You know, I say this about the guests. I really don't invite anybody I'm not excited about, so that's how that works. But we got to talking when we were down in Key West. Andrea was our not just wardrobe person down there, but also just a humongous help in terms of the show in general and talking through what was going on stage, and was a tremendous resource as we were getting the show together. In addition to working on the show, which was definitely full-time work, we got to talking about a lot of things in general, and particularly I became fascinated by the way you were discussing sustainability. You were helping me understand, and we'll talk about it as we go, that there are really some objectives that are out there in the world that I wasn't even aware existed, first of all, never mind supporting having them work. So I wanted to have you come on and talk to us about all that, and talk to us about it even in the context of the work you do as a professor in terms of theater design and sustainability. So here we are, and we can have some more conversation, but I'm truly excited to have you here. And I just want to ask you the question. I know I shared with you, and you checked out the podcast, I shared with you that the question is, how and or when did you know that sustainability would be a big part of your life?
Well, as an adult, it was more recent. But the short version is that I grew up in a family of conservationists. And so environmental awareness and activism has been a part of my life always. My dad is a landscape designer, horticulturist. My brothers are in the trade, and my sisters are educators. My mom's an artist. And so that has always been a part of our lives. But I think, and I tell my students this, one of the things I think that is a problem with sustainability and how it's perceived, even organizationally, but just sort of culturally, is that it's like a side gig for people. It's like your thing you do on weekends, right? Like you go to a protest, or you're doing your volunteer work or whatever. And that's amazing. And I think that's good.
Right.
But I had that in my head. Like it was my side gig. It was my identity that supplemented and informed who I am as an artist and as a teacher and educator. So it wasn't really until about 5 years ago, I was on our university's strategic planning council. And, I was sitting there like, I don't know what a strategic plan really is. And why did they ask me?
That's funny.
But that's academia for you. So you happen to be a nice person. They're like, she'll be good on this committee. I attended a presentation by our campus sustainability coordinator. And really, it was one of those moments where things started to clear in a way for me. So it was on the global goals for sustainable development. And the way they're presented in terms of an approach that incorporates people, the planet, and prosperity. I mean, it was what I had been looking for to bring pieces of my life together in a really dynamic way. And I got so excited about it. I just started learning more and more. And then I realized that I didn't need to separate sustainability action and change agency in my life as my side gig, that what I could do as an educator was embed sustainability into all of my teaching and all of my practice and all of my identity. And that's been so exciting because then, and I think for my students, they get excited because they go, oh, you can bring all of the parts of you together in a really intentional way.
Yes.
And so you don't have to think, oh, I'm an over here I'm an artist, over here I'm a mom, over here I'm a gardener, over here I'm an environmental activist. But through sustainability, you bring all of those things together, you figure out your assets, what you're really good at doing, and then you focus in on that and you do it.
I was a little bit surprised to hear the word prosperity in that discussion and in the discussion we had and in your answer today. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because my general sense is that we talk about, the captains of industry and they want to make money and that's what they want to do. And then they're against the tree huggers who, don't care about such things and just want to, make sure that the flowers are allowed to be as beautiful as they need to be. So when you mentioned prosperity there, I'm like, what's the relationship there? How's that all go?
I hug my trees, and it is also expensive to keep a yard going. So I like to keep my trees healthy. I mean, I'm being a little bit flip about it, but the fact of the matter is, the big we can be really, really idealistic about things and say, oh, we shouldn't concern ourselves with money and wealth. And, and I just think that there's a privilege to being able to say that or even have that perspective when so many people in the world want for basic necessities and deserve to have a level of prosperity that allows them the freedom to go through life without the friction of poverty and hunger and poor health. And so prosperity equally is a very important part of sustainability. And so when people in the sustainability world talk about sustainability, our understanding today is that it's about the environment, it's also about people, and it's about economics. And those are the three pillars of sustainability. So however you want to say it, people, planet, prosperity is kind of nice. But really, environment, people, or society and economics, and how those things interplay together. And when you start thinking about systems, you can't really pull them apart. Things start to fall apart if you just look at one.
Yes.
If you're just looking at economics and you're not really thinking about how the health of our planet contributes to, healthy economics, or the health of people contributes to healthy economies.
Right.
I mean, the intersections abound.
Health can impact the economy. Who would have thought it? And certainly there's nothing going on that suggests we could be taking a look at that.
Suddenly we're all experts in this.
Right. So another piece, because there were several that stood out to me as you were describing, your path in and your thinking around it, is this whole idea of it being siloed. And so the idea of people looking at it as like, we do the things we do, and there's also sustainability over here. And that resonated for me when we spoke, because having done DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that's something that I had said about that as well. As it's sort of like, we have our hiring practices and we have our buying over here and we have this over here, and then there's a DEI committee. And I'm like, well, that's all that is, So help me understand how that came together for you, and sort of maybe how you're sharing it more specifically with your students, because I thought some of that conversation was fascinating. But also, how can those who are listening be starting to see the connections a little bit more, and not seeing it as sort of like, I send in a check sometimes when my friends who are crazy about it ask me to, and other than that, I sort of live my life.
Right. So I also think that one of the mistakes of maybe the last few decades of environmental activism has, been this idea that everything else falls away and we're really focused hardcore on the environment. And the thing is, when we do that, there's a certain place of privilege to be able to do that. And also it's dismissing the fact that in so many cases, the front lines of environmental suffering, right? Like the suffering that's happening right now because of climate change is happening in places where there's extreme poverty, to communities that have been marginalized over generations, if not hundreds of years, right? And so we have to, start looking at what has been done through the lens of environmental justice and bring communities in, particularly Indigenous communities, to start really solving some of these problems in a more holistic way. And so it's about embracing folks. It's about acknowledging injustice that continues to this day, and building big coalitions across different groups of folks. And so I think one of the challenges in the community right now, in the sustainability community, is really articulating that diversity, equity, and inclusion are embedded in sustainability efforts. Oh, wow. When we really look at those three pillars and we say, yeah, it's about people, then we really have to acknowledge the kinds of inequities that have happened around the world. We have to look at colonialism and the impacts of that, our economic systems, and how those were formed out of colonialism, and who was deliberately left behind. And when we start to do that and say, oh, environmentalism, environmental justice has to embrace DEI efforts, and then maybe we'll have a chance at successful.
Right.
And that's exciting to me. The United Nations Sustainability Program, the Sustainable Development Goals, were born out of the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals had been really criticized for being sort of a top-down, global north, telling the global south what they should do, right? In terms of the environment or economics. And there were a lot of really good intentions and really good ideas embedded in those, but they really, walked away and decided that these needed to be redesigned. And the goals incorporate so many of the United Nations' amazing programs, that really do such incredible good around the world. But what they needed to do was they needed to incorporate planning from stakeholders, big and small, from the little island nations to the big sprawling, economic powerhouses, and everyone in between. And so in 2015, they rolled out the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, also called the Global Goals. Okay. And there's 17 goals for sustainable development. And that sounds crazy, 17, until you realize that there were stakeholders literally around the world. College campuses like mine contributed. Oh, wow. NGOs, corporations, nation states, individuals, children contributed to this. And they developed these 17 goals out of contributions from around the world. And 193 nations of the United Nations in 2015 came together and voted to support the global goals. Oh, wow. So within those 17 goals, diversity, equity, and inclusion are reflected in many different ways. And one of the goals is reduced inequalities, whether we're looking at it globally or whether we're looking at it in communities. Again, a small island nation with communities or a large developed economic powerhouse nation. Inequalities come in different forms. Sure. And people are marginalized in different ways. But reducing inequalities is a core principle of sustainability. Acknowledging that if we don't make the playing ground deliberately more equal for folks, right? If we don't provide pathways for girls and women to get educated, right? Wow. Or for folks to get access to basic healthcare or sanitation. How are we going to solve our big existential problems, right?
And one of the things that strikes me about the way you're describing that and looking at the inequities on all these levels is that, I mean, it's sort of the macro and micro of not in my backyard, right? Like part of why otherwise marginalized people tend to bear the brunt is because they don't necessarily have the power to literally say, no, not in my backyard, whereas some other communities do. I'm wondering, nationally, I guess, unless globally is a better way to frame it, I'm just curious how and where that shows up. I mean, I think people are aware of Flint, and that kind of thing, in terms of water, and that's a little different. That's environment, but yes. But I'm just wondering where you see that in our country specifically.
Oh my God, Flint is a good example. I mean, and the same thing is happening in Newark, New Jersey, and the same kind of thing, not lead, but it makes me sick to even talk about. But PFOAs, they're a chemical class that come from flame retardants and like plastic coatings and things. I mean, this gets into some pretty scary science, but they're a chemical class that has been used by the military and industry for the last 75 years. And so just right here in the beautiful Hudson Valley, Newburgh, which is just about 20 miles south of where I live, had a big Air Force base, and it's still got an Air National Guard part of the base. And unfortunately, the use of these flame retardants go into the water systems really easily. And they contaminated the city of Newburgh's water system. Wow. And that is something that is just now really coming to the forefront of people's consciousness right here in the Hudson Valley and in one of the communities that I live adjacent to. And so these are Flint, Newark, Newburgh. These are examples of how decisions made by people decades ago, right, in places where they weren't being concerned about the local population. They were doing certain things, for whatever reasons, whether they were aware of it or not, right? Building water systems out of lead pipes, using flame retardants with these synthetic chemicals. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's both environmental and it's social, because it's polluting our water systems and it's creating a public health crisis where people are getting cancer and other neurological
That's what I was gonna ask,
problems. And so they're so embedded. I just don't see how you pull these things apart at all. And then you add in the social aspect that these things are happening in communities that are typically underserved, that are impoverished, that don't have the kind of resources to allow them, to mitigate the issue, let alone get health care for, children and grandparents that are suffering the side effects. And so this is happening right here in the United States, but we really can look around the world from, pollution from industry, from the fashion industry in Indonesia to the leather industry in Bangladesh. I mean, I could give you examples.
No, but it's good because it helps to give a real sense of the size of it, the scope of what we're discussing. And I mean, you've touched on at least, between the military, fashion, you were just sort of wandering through and casually talking. We probably talked about 3 or 4 major areas of industry, and that's not exhaustive. I'm curious how much these experiences, like let's say in Newburgh, is there a shift in terms of the politics of these areas? Because one of my impression is that there's so much distance between cause and effect sometimes. I get the sense that people sort of vaguely go, that's not right, but don't necessarily, even when they've been personally impacted, don't necessarily then become galvanized around, now I will care. What are you seeing generally around that?
I think that it's rough because when people are suffering, it's hard to have the energy to get galvanized. It's like, in a way, it's too late, And I think that, I study this stuff and I have to acknowledge my own privilege, right? Of being able to, I'm lucky, like at the moment I'm healthy and I work on a university campus. And so I'm just acknowledging that, right? That I'm not embedded, in communities where the suffering is happening. But, from studying this and hearing interviews and getting politically involved, I do see that there's a real fatigue, on the part of working class folks. And, I don't care where they sit on the political spectrum or if they do at all. They're beat, they're tired of it and they don't see a lot of progress being made politically.
Right.
And so that worries me. And, interestingly, it kind of brings up something I was thinking about yesterday, because in my ethical fashion class that I'm teaching this semester, as an introductory exercise, I had the students writing down, what are your biggest concerns in the world today? And then what are the things that bring you the most joy and hope? We're always trying to kind of go back and forth and balance. And I think this is what we need to maybe be doing in communities, is going in and talking to folks, like, what are your big concerns? Like, what's happening in your community and what worries you? And so for my college students, we went around the circle and so many of them said complacency. And I was really surprised. Yeah. I guess I just always think that they're going to say the climate emergency. And I think now, in a way, for college students, they're like, of course, the climate emergency.
Right.
They're all super stressed out. So they're like, well, I'm not going to say that because that's stressing us all out. Like, that's our baseline now, which is sad. But I think, they're really seeing that fatigue from folks and they sense it in their own lives. That there's just a sense of disempowerment. And so that's something I really think we have to combat against and build up some teams that emerge out of communities. They're much more grassroots and then create pathways for political action and success. And we know that can work.
Right.
But we've got to spread the positive anecdotes and stories and then really empower folks to get involved, take political action in a local way.
I want to rewind a little bit because you told us a little bit about your family, and it does sort of seem like there's some, as you were talking about your family, I was like, oh, a lot of what what I know about you makes a ton of sense in this context. But before we go there, do you have a story you would share that does what you're describing? Somewhere where sustainability was discussed, addressed, what have you, and people took action and made a change locally or in their, whatever space they were able to make a difference.
I love the word local because we do get really overwhelmed by the global nature of this. And I think a critical piece of sustainability action is being connected in your local communities and saying, what can I do here? Like, ask the question, like, what's the problem? What can I do? Why do I care? That's good too. Why do I care about this? And what am I going to do about it, right? And this really combats complacency, because if we get focused on the big picture too much, I think it's be aware of the big picture. And then you have to go, okay, but where am I right now? Where are my feet planted? Who are the people around me and what do I care about? There are some amazing examples, but one is an example in the Navajo Nation, the Dine, which is what the Navajo Nation calls themselves. They actually collectively basically booted out a mining corporation. And so that was an opportunity for jobs for their people.
Right.
But this was an operation that was polluting, that was really the side effects of that were causing incredible health problems. And so, they kicked them out. And so I think that's the kind of example, we can look to, is when folks really look at their own community and say, what do we need here? What's right for us? And so a very specific example. So that's kind of like a big inspirational, like, the little guys fight the big corporation and say, get
Got them out of there.
Of our community, But I have a student who is a creative writing major, and he, by his own admission, just said, he has always thought positively about sustainability, but like so many people, he was like, well, that's like environmental activists who go to marches and, like the Fridays for the Future, Greta Thunberg, protesters. And he was like, it just wasn't his vibe. And anyway, he took my intro to sustainability class, and it made him more conscious of the folks in his own community in Port Washington, which is on Long Island, who were they're standing up against developers that are trying to put, these massive sort of, residential developments right on the valuable waterfront. And they're grassroots organizations right there in Port Washington who are fighting this development. It's not the like sort of like change is bad folks. It's more like, we want to preserve our waterways. And the biodiversity, the beauty and the biodiversity of those shoreline communities that are really already being impacted by climate change and sea level rise. And so once he started realizing, like, wait a second, I care about my local community. I want to be involved in this. He started hearing things from his local community in different ways and being tuned into what folks were doing, and that they're concerned about affordable housing in their community. They're concerned about appropriate development and the right, size and cost and with environmental, considerations. And so he's gotten involved and he's working with them to do like, more effective social media campaigns to raise public awareness among young people like himself. And that kind of individual activism by a college student who before thought, who am I? I'm just a kid. I'm a 20-year-old going to college. Like, what difference can I make? And then he realized he does have skills. He's really invested in his community, and he cares very much about the social and environmental and, economic health of his own local community. So.
And your story highlights one of the things I found most inspiring when we were talking, because this really getting folks in touch with this idea of, yes, you too, but maybe you in your specific way. So I love the idea of social media. You got a handle on it? Great. Because probably a lot of people who are involved do not. And so great, get on in here. I like that sort of like, I'm generally that sort of person anyhow, sort of stone soup kind of a deal where, it's like, yeah, everybody add your stuff in. I'm sure it'll be delicious in the end. And so what can we be doing I'll just speak for myself. What can I be doing? Here I am in Los Angeles. I live in Windsor Hills. I live in an area that is undergoing, I guess the word has to be gentrification to some degree. There's definitely, there's a huge building being built over here and there's some condos that are appearing over there. How should I be looking at figuring out what to do from my position of I'm one person and, I have talents as a storyteller and, and a coach? Where does that leave me?
I love that. And this is, I teach theater students, right? I teach students from across the university, but so often my theater students are like, well, what skills do I have that I can bring? And I'm like, are you kidding me? We need effective communicators. We need folks to tell the stories, right? We need folks to gather stories and connect the stories, right, with the folks who are doing, into the political action, right, into policy making, town boards, right, community boards, school boards. We need the effective communicators to show up at those places and say, all right, I'm going to tell you why that's important to me, because so many people are terrified to stand up in front of a group of people, right?
Yeah.
If that's something that doesn't scare you, then you can be the person representing a group of grassroots activists who are trying to communicate,
That's awesome.
the needs of a community, right? Or that, and this can be small and large. And I really do believe in the small, the small actions really do build up in a collective way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it may be things like access to green space that a community needs. And I don't know what, anyone's specific community needs, but this is just an example in urban areas, right? It's like green space, for folks little and old, to go be healthy in it. And we know, we have the statistics, the communities that have access to natural green spaces that are easy to get to, right? And that have a variety of kinds of things to do, from clear walkways to benches, to splash pads and playgrounds. Right. When you have a variety of things like that people feel comfortable and safe in, they are healthier, and healthier people have more time to be engaged in their communities, and they give back, and it's this amazing virtuous cycle, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing that I tell my students. I'm like, really, that's the micro, look at your community and find out what people need and what folks are advocating for. And if you're somebody who's comfortable talking, then be the talker, you volunteer, you go to the organizing meeting. And then when they're like, well, who's going to stand up at the town council or the town board? And, well, be the person who says, I don't have a problem. Help me figure out what the script is going to be, and I'll go say it, And so I think that really does matter. And I also think empowering folks to not feel like your concern or your need in your community is marginal. If you have that need or that desire for the green space or the bike path or the public transportation, right? A bus stop,
right?
Near an old folks' home, so they don't have to walk so far. These seem like small things, but they're so big. And we know that when someone has a need or a desire for access to something that reduces the friction in their lives,
right?
Then, it cascades out into positive effects.
Right.
And so, now I'm really going on, but I say to young people, but anyone, middle-aged folks like us, anybody can say, well, wow, maybe I am at a point of privilege and I'm lucky enough to have the things I need. But what I can do is get involved in my community and start talking to folks and find out who's not being represented, who doesn't feel like they have a voice and they have a need. And can I partner with that person and figure out how to get that need met?
Yeah.
And that's service. That's real service. We can get outside of our own needs and our own selves and our own, stuff.
And it connects me to a word you used earlier. Privilege is a word you used and earlier. And it seems to me, Doug Harris was somebody who's mentored me in terms of consulting. And one of the things he talks about in terms of privilege is that one of the most powerful things that any of us can do is to learn how to manage our own privilege, even if we're part of a group of people who, sometimes on the sort of outsider side of one of those equations. And it seems to me this is a prime area for that kind of thinking. That, like you said, if people who are dealing with contaminated water are exhausted for good reason and or, sick, that those of us who don't have contaminated water have an opportunity to say, we got you, and go in and sort of stand up for them. I guess two pieces to this. One, how do you encourage that? Because I know you do. And then also, again, where can we be looking for opportunities to encourage and or be the person who steps up for others?
Yeah, I think example is the best, Well, first of all, I'll talk about privilege a little bit, right? It's always the scale that's sort of moving and shifting, and depending on where you're looking at, right? There's privilege or there's marginalization. And so I really work with my students to help them be self-aware of that, maybe it's like a prism, right?
Yeah.
And like looking at themselves through it and then looking out at the world through it too at the same time. And, we talk about the privilege of being educated, and it's hard. I work at a state university. And so, a lot of my students are first gen.
Right.
Kids, their families did not have the privilege of going, to college. And for many of them, there's incredible family sacrifice for them to be in college. And there's a lot of pressure with that,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
they're pinching pennies. And they're going, I don't feel so privileged.
Right.
I'm eating my crappy college student food, and I've, and I'm staying up all night studying, and I don't feel so privileged. And then we look at it and we go, the high quality education that folks can get in the United States.
Sure.
If you can get yourself to college, like that is an amazing privilege to have that access to that education. And so that's, what I try to encourage them is like, that's a power, that's some amazing, like you can have gratitude for that privilege, and then don't be ashamed about it. Like celebrate that, and then take yourself back to your communities,
right?
And start like seeking out, again, like I talked about, the voices, right? Like the people who aren't being represented, that you have a connection, like an authentic connection with.
Right.
So you're not somebody going in and saying, let me come in and solve your problems,
Sure.
Like we don't need any more of that in the world. That's so like the colonial, patriarchal sort of like,
Savior.
whatever, we're going to come. Yeah. We'll come build your house and then leave feeling really good about ourselves, but that wasn't actually what you needed, right?
Right.
So,
right. I do want, though, to talk a little bit about you, because the topics we touched on have been fascinating. But I also found just talking to you fascinating when we were down in Key West, and since we've had a chance to connect. You mentioned, now how many siblings again?
I'm the oldest of 5.
Oldest of 5. Okay, so you mentioned, your family, your father being a horticulturalist. I'm curious about life in that family, and what, if anything, about growing up in that family prepared you, primed you, whatever the right way to frame it is, for a life where you have been so committed to sustainability.
Oh, that's really nice of you to ask. Thanks. There's a lot that prepared me, for sure. I mean, my grandpa had what in Utah is called a dry farm. Meaning you have to irrigate. You can't depend on, the clouds to provide the water. I mean, this is it's farming in the high mountain desert. Was never a great idea. It doesn't work so well. But he was just such a hard worker. And he just cared about families so much. And he had 8 kids. My mom is the 7th of 8 kids. And, this connection to the land and the idea of stewardship, that you have a responsibility to the land and the animals and the people in your community, that was just really deeply embedded in my grandpa's ethos. And then my dad married into this agricultural family, and he had come out west from Cleveland, and my heritage on that side of the family are immigrant, gardeners, miners, laborers, and so my dad had come out west to be in the Forest Service, and then ended up going into horticulture, and then married into this Utah agricultural family. And so it was this really wonderful marriage of folks who really deeply cared about the land and our whole, the biodiversity, the whole system that goes into it. And so, I was just really raised with that, a sense of respect that I'm not separate from the land. I'm not separate from the plants and the other creatures. Like we're all in this together. And the minute you have a sense of superiority over that, Like that ego is basically what my grandpa didn't have. He would, he was very, very humble. And then my dad, working at the State University, Utah State, that was my undergraduate alma mater, was the state horticulturist for years. And so he drove around Utah. I mean, he knows the back roads, the high mountain passes, the little towns. He probably knows every diner in Utah and all of the old guys who sit in those diners, and he will talk to them.
That's funny.
And so he spent years driving around, helping people in these small agricultural communities practice better agricultural techniques and horticultural techniques, right? Bringing native plant species back into, our home horticulture, but on farms. And one of the groups of people, I won't go into this too much, but part of his work is he worked on the Navajo Nation in the Four Corners region. And he worked with them in, teaching them how to prune in their peach orchards, for example. And one of the initiatives that he worked on was helping them bring back the native dye plants, which, had really been, because of pressure, right? Modernization. Folks had just been using synthetic dyes, which that's a whole other topic I can talk about. It's how unhealthy those are. And so it's this idea of bringing back the native plant species for the basket weaving and the native plants for dyeing, but also for medicinal uses. And that's really his specialty. And he also got involved in this project to help bring back the indigenous sheep, the Navajo Churro sheep, which had been almost eradicated by the United States government in the early 20th century and replaced by these domestic sheep breeds that were not suitable for the Four Corners region. And so my dad got involved in the Navajo Churro sheep project. And all of this is just an example of if my dad was doing it, the whole family was doing it.
Okay.
And so we were just always aware of you can't separate out, the plants, the land, the animals, the people. And this just gets back to sustainability, right? Yeah. I think for me, because I just grew up in it and have this sensibility, if all of these things are in balance, then everything's healthy, right? We're living in a regenerative system where we're giving back and we're participating in, and we're enjoying the bounty of, but we're not taking, right? We're not extracting. We're doing things that give back.
The word you use there, balance, really strikes me because in many ways, I feel like that is a concept that would serve us well. Balance is a real thing. It doesn't mean every single person and every single animal and every single has exactly the same everywhere, but just a sense of balance strikes me as an important piece of this. And that often what I notice when people do affirmatively make choices, sometimes we don't know, right? We don't know, and then something goes wrong and we go, oh my goodness, it's because we were growing this plant here. Okay. But there are other times when choices are made. And it seems to me that often the trouble comes from a lack of balance. Yes, profit, but also people. And I think that's why I really reacted when you talked about prosperity, people, planet. And what would happen if we brought that thinking into all of it? What if even, I think we can all say, oh yeah, if Amazon, stop sending me the big box with all the plastic in it. And we can all, oh yeah, okay. But, or the CVS receipts or the other things that we kind of all point to. But also I think, as you point out from the other side, what can we be doing with social entrepreneurial efforts, right? Can we be looking at some of these things and saying, where might there be profit in this in a manner that would help sustain the effort and in a manner that might also attract people to the effort who might not have been attracted to it in the first place? I'm just curious, is any of that what you're seeing or would like to see, or how could we move that forward?
Well, I think that's what has to happen. Ultimately, we are critically out of balance. We could go down this rabbit hole. Like this is a whole other conversation. But I mean, I think, if anyone who does listen to this or who's interested wants to know more about how imbalanced we are, there's an amazing new documentary that's on Netflix called Breaking Boundaries.
Okay.
And, it really gets into the science of climate change, but also all of the things on our planet that are out of balance right now. And when we reach a tipping point, it's not just that one thing that is a problem. It's the cascade effect of how, like ocean acidification and like bleaching of coral reefs. It's not only the coral reefs, right? That's a whole system that there are going to be negative implications cascading out that we can't ignore. Like that, it's like we're ultimately harming ourselves, right? Through getting to the tipping points of these systems. So we're critically out of balance right now. We are not so out of balance that we can't pull things back. And that's one of the things the documentary does really well, is it explains, if we do these things in these areas, to pull back, then it has a positive impact over here and helps draw that back down into a balanced, way for our planet.
Right.
And so that's a big idea for our whole planet. But if we look at every system, we can find small ways where we go like, this is out of balance, right? And again, whether it's, we're not talking about like every person and every animal or every system on this planet needing all of the same things. It is about balance that's appropriate in the place and for, that system. And so how do we, start looking again, we'll go back to the local. How do we look at the local and we say, what's out of balance here? What, and you're right. You mentioned something like that things happen where a lot of times it was out of ignorance, right? The imbalance was created not in a malignant way, right?
Sure.
But it was created, because maybe there was opportunity or it seemed like a good idea. But I will say, I'm not so Pollyanna about it because there are a lot of really crappy things that have been done that folks have known. And just getting back to the economic part of it too, is this isn't about sacrifice so much. It really is about looking for opportunity for better health, for more balance for all of us. Right. And there is incredible opportunity. And there are examples of some amazing, not only, entrepreneur, like cutting edge stuff, but established companies that are looking at it and going like, wait a second, our bottom line actually could be positively impacted, if we start to really, we do the right thing and we capitalize on that. And it's not about greenwashing or just like saying, right, like this tag is recycled. Sure. An example, and maybe I shouldn't promote, but there's a fashion company, and this is like my whole, fashion textile industry is kind of my specialty. But there's a company called Everlane.
Okay.
And there's a really interesting interview with their CEO about really like bearing down and prioritizing best practices. And, again, it's not about company sacrifice. It's saying we really believe in these things. And we know right now, because of supply chains and complexities in the fashion industry, we're not going to be perfect, but we're going to be transparent. And we're going to let our consumers know what we're working on, where we need to get better, how we're trying. And they use the example of like reducing synthetic, like virgin synthetic fibers from their fashion lines. So they only use recycled nylon, for example, for fishing nets and recycled carpeting and stuff like that. But that they were really struggling with those poly bags. You know how you order, everything you order comes in one of those poly bags?
Yeah.
And they were like, that's really a hard problem right now. Because if they don't use the poly bag, like things, fall in the factories, they get dirty, they don't see, like there are just lots of problems.
Yeah.
And the CEO was basically like, we know that's a problem. We are working hard on it. We're bearing down. Our products still come in poly bags, and now that's starting to change because they've been intentional and they're saying, we want a better product. So they're saying to their supplier, we want a product that at the minimum is recycled,
Right.
And that's where we are right now. We're going to be transparent with our consumers. And so I think there's incredible opportunity if companies, entrepreneurs, if folks just say like, I'm going to say that I value this and I'm going to go out into the world and we're going to work really hard on it. We're going to acknowledge it's really hard to be perfect.
Yeah.
But look, superheroes aren't perfect, right? They've all got their flaws.
Right.
We can't let perfection get in the way of progress.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of walking in that way, because I think sometimes too, it can feel like, well, if we can't stop the ice caps tomorrow, then what's the point? I'll just do what I'm doing. It's like, well, that's not quite how that works. So I do want to ask a couple of things, and I realize where we are on time. And you talked about cascading effects. And for me, that's such a tremendous piece of my growing understanding. And I feel like I'm in many ways in my, infancy, but something close to infancy in terms of really thinking about environmental issues. One of the things that I impressed upon my kids, and I'm sure that they will say with quite the eye roll in the years to come, is it's not the thing, it's the thing after the thing, right? I would, even when they were little, so they'd put, their cup at the edge of whatever. And I'm like, it's not the thing, it's the thing after the thing. All right, if you put it there, then what's going to happen next? Then what's going to happen next?
I'm going to steal that. Yes.
So it's not the thing, it's the thing after the thing. And so as a parent, because I know you're so invested in your role as a parent, right? How are you communicating that, like the cascading effects? What, is there a product you choose or don't choose? Or is there a kind of vacation you take or don't take? We've talked about what was given to you, so before, but I guess maybe, a little bit about after. As a parent, how are you doing that?
Yeah, I think, Finn's 9. And so at this point, he's starting to understand complexity in much more sophisticated ways.
Sure.
And he's also absorbing much more from the world. And I mean, our kids are even more now, right? So there's a lot of real stuff happening. I explained to him, why we make choices, right? And I think it's also important to say, like, it's not about virtue signaling. We're not doing it to look a certain way, right? Like, you need to understand why you're doing something and be invested in it and be okay with doing it quietly, even if nobody else knows, like knowing that there's a reason, right? That we're all connected to these bigger systems, right? And each of us, we're multitudes in terms of the systems we're connected to. So if I can help Finn understand, that he's not really an individual. He's part of this really beautiful, spectacularly interconnected network of life that we are all we have always existed on a molecular level, and we will always exist. And so the food that we put in our bodies, right? The water that we drink, all of that, it builds literally who we are. And so if I can help him understand that and then go, when we make the choice to grow vegetables in our garden, that's not just mommy's hobby. That's kind of quirky, middle-aged lady hobby. But it's because it's really important for us to understand where our food comes from and what it tastes like and how to prepare it in a healthy way. And when he does that, I know, he's connecting with more than just the food. He's connecting with the insects that are pollinating, right? He's connecting with the fact that we're not putting chemicals on our, plants. that the plants need water and that our water comes from somewhere. We don't just turn the hose on, but we have a well. And the well is connected to the whole Hudson Valley, watershed, the estuary system. And so that's what I do is I'm just constantly trying to teach them about the systems and thinking about when I make a choice, I want to be conscious about the system, that choice impacts and also the systems that have led me to making that choice. And if I'm just constantly doing that, like imperfections abound, it is really rough in our industrialized American consumer, corporate, capitalist, crazy society to make virtuous and pure choices. Like it is so far from that right now. Yeah. But if we can be more conscious and we can talk to each other about how to do that in not a condescending or superior, or like, I know how to do this kind of way, we can start to do that with our children and in our communities and with each other and help each other as a group be making healthier, more balanced choices. That's going to have a big positive impact. Culture doesn't happen to us. We make culture. Our choices make the culture we have.
And so just to wrap up, I do want to ask, as you sign up, what's sort of, whether it's a distillation of things you've said so far or something we didn't get to, just one thing that if you could share with anyone who's listening, either they could do, be thinking about, be looking into, whatever it is that you've looked into this so much. What would that final message be?
That is so hard. There's so many, right? I would say find the thing that you care about and then act. I can't tell anybody what the thing is that they should be working on. But going back to what I was saying about my students being worried about complacency. Yeah. It's like, just care about one thing and figure out how to get involved in that thing. Yeah. And the magic of it is, and I see it over and over again, is that one thing grows and it creates networks of care. And you find yourself then interacting with folks who care about other stuff that's related or things that you didn't even know about. And then suddenly you're like, well, dang, I care about that too. And I have an opportunity to this. And so just, pick something and don't feel fatalistic. Like we don't have room for learned helplessness. And we don't have room for sort of that fatalism. Like, well, the climate crisis is too big. And so we might as well just live today and hope for the best for tomorrow. That's not actually going to work out so well. So seriously. It's like, just, engage in one thing and take a little bit of time out of your life to engage in that thing in a really hyper local, very personal way. Yeah. And then see where that path takes you. And great things will happen. They are happening around the world. And if, your listeners are interested, there are two websites I'm going to plug.
Great. I was going to ask that next.
So one is globalgoals.org. Okay. And so you can look it up, Sustainable Development Goals, but globalgoals.org. And, the exciting thing is you can look at all 17 goals. And I encourage folks to look at one that they think just, bam, I really care about that, right? Like my big global goal is goal number 12, which is responsible production and consumption. And that's because I'm a maker, right? I'm a designer. I'm someone who creates things in the world. So I have to, it's my responsibility to learn how to do that in a, healthier way for the planet and for people. So find one global goal that you really just connect with without having to think about it. Maybe it's life underwater because you live in a coastal community, right? And that's your thing. And then go to that section of the website and look at the stories of people really making a difference in their local communities. So it's an amazing resource. It's really interactive. They've got parts of it for kids. It's for all ages. It's incredible. It's a global program that is focused on the local, and then it helps us realize that our local actions are global actions. Mm-hmm. And then the other one that I recommend is regeneration.org.
Okay.
And that's an amazing, activist, scholar, inspiring guru, Paul Hawken. And he has a new book out, Regeneration. And I've got it right here because I'm reading it right now. I'm using it for class, but it's Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. And it's really solutions-based across the board, from the social to the environmental to the economic. And it combines these things together. It brings in indigenous wisdom and honoring, that idea that we're all incredibly beautifully interconnected. Mm-hmm. And when we acknowledge that and we start acting on that, we can really solve these critical problems of the 21st century. So regeneration.org, super inspiring. You can read stuff that's going on and get involved with organizations in communities that you care about right now.
Phenomenal. Thanks so much for being here
thank you.
Teaching us
thank
so much.
You.
All right, y'all, it's time to walk the line. So here's your walk the line for episode 3 of season 2. Do something. Okay, I'll be a little more specific. Do something about sustainability. Let's face it, if you knew anybody who treated their home the way we treat our collective home, you would not visit that person very often. But how? Well, when we use the Align methodology, there's always one how that we commit to doing here and now. So let's start with a step I know we can all take. Head over to globalgoals.org and check out the 17 goals Andrea discussed in this episode. Then choose one of those goals and challenge yourself to take one step toward making a difference. Something I tell my teams is, if everybody does something, nobody has to do everything. Here's one thing you can do. Head over to We Align, join Team We Align, and vote in our poll. I can't wait to see where y'all are deciding to focus. From there, maybe we start a conversation about steps we're each taking, and who knows, some steps we could take together. I'm just spitballing here, but when I'm done, I'm gonna recycle them spitballs. Until next time, you can join the conversation in We Align at wealign.alignp.com. Visit the Align Performance Facebook page, at Align Performance on TikTok, and follow at AlignP on Twitter. Now, if you like what you just heard, be sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, we gon' get unstuck. We gon' be unstuck. We gon' live unstuck. Unstuck as fuck. Now, let's walk the line.